Today we will be reading Mark 2, verses 23 to 27. A discussion about the Sabbath. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the scriptures that David did when Haven't you ever read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people, and not the people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath." The word of the Lord.
Thanks so much, Isioma. Good morning. It's great to be with you. Happy Father's Day. My name is Ian, and I'm one of the pastors here. The violin virtuoso and philosopher Stephen Nachmanovich said this: "Perhaps the most radical socio-political invention of the past 4,000 years was the Sabbath. The practice of the Sabbath recognizes that we need space and time reserved from the rushing and pressures of everyday life, reserved for going inside ourselves for rest, review, and revelation." Nachmanovich is not writing as a Christian, he's writing as a philosopher of human creativity and consciousness. And that might surprise you. The Sabbath doesn't always get such high praise. In our cultural imagination, it's often bound up with stifling regulations, with killjoy, with boredom. In American literature, it's often tied up with New England Puritans, right? And our own Baltimorean H.L. Mencken once famously satirized Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. Mencken totally misread the Puritans, but his read, I think, stands in for the way a lot of us think about the Sabbath. Isn't this just stifling all the good stuff? In 2024 in Maryland, doesn't this just mean that I can't get a bottle of wine and some Chick-fil-A on the day I most need it? It is probably worth noting that in both Jewish tradition and in Christian tradition, there's historically been a tendency to miss the point of Sabbath by overdeveloping what it's not for and by underdeveloping what it is for. Some of you were here just 5 months ago when we did a deeper dive on this passage, our teaching text this morning, in its context as we were preaching through Mark's gospel. If you were there, you might remember we talked about the fact in Jesus' day, there were all sorts of accreted regulations about what you can do and cannot do on the Sabbath. The Mishnah, which was a collection of rabbinical teachings dating to several hundred years after Jesus, but which in many cases probably is capturing things that were going on the ground in Jesus' day. It lists 39 don't-dos on the Sabbath, and one of them was harvesting grain. I'm encouraged that we live in a cultural moment when many Christians, especially younger Christians, are rediscovering the gift rather than the burden of Sabbath. And gift rather than burden does seem to be at the heart of what Jesus is saying there in verse 27. The Sabbath was made for people, and not people for the Sabbath. We're not going to do a deep dive on this teaching text in its context. If you want that, go back and look at the podcast or the YouTube channel from late January. It's a teaching called Jesus and Religion. Today we're talking about Sabbath and formation. I want to start by giving you a picture in your mind and then a working definition. Here's the picture to put in your mind. Probably, no, not that picture to put in your mind, a different one, a word picture. Probably 8, 9 years ago, I fell into the routine of putting our young kids to sleep often by lying in bed with them and reading them a story and praying with them or telling them a story. And often I would lie on my back in bed and they would put their head here or here, and my arm would circle around to hold the book or to comfort them as I told them a story. And when Declan was probably 3 years old, he started referring to this part of my anatomy as the story hole. The story hole. And that got passed down through our kids. So all of our kids now talk about this as the story hole. And it doesn't matter how well they've listened during the day. It doesn't matter how many times I've had to say, take your foot off your sister's neck, or it doesn't matter how well they have done or not done their chores that day. At the end of the day, there's no more working to be done. There's resting to be done. And often they want to do it, and always they are welcome to do it in the story hole. So last night, I hadn't even thought to include this in the sermon, but last night I was putting Baird down to sleep. He said, Daddy, I come in the story hole. I said, yeah, man, you're always welcome in the story hole. I love it, too, when you're in the story hole. I share this not because it's an anecdote that puts me in the role of God. Yes, I did notice that. But because I think we never outgrow the longing for the story hole and what it represents. And there is something profoundly better than the story hole that what God wants to give you, and it is hard to receive it without Sabbath keeping. Here's a working definition of Sabbath keeping for us this morning. Sabbath keeping is forming a habit of ceasing from work to enjoy unearned security in God. Every bit of that is important for this morning. It's forming a habit of ceasing from work to enjoy unearned security from God. There's a lot that this definition leaves out about Sabbath. It doesn't talk about the justice dimensions. It doesn't talk about the ethical dimensions. It doesn't talk about the biblical theological dimensions. I'll point you to some other resources for that. But today we're talking about the shaping of our souls. First, though, we need to zoom out and talk about how Christian habits work more broadly. So we're stepping back. Everyone seems to agree that Christians ought to be different. Christians believe that Christians ought to be different from non-Christians, and non-Christians certainly expect that Christians would be different than non-Christians. In fact, you've probably all heard the statistics about how those of us who call ourselves Christians, when it comes to our ethical and behavioral patterns, we are virtually indistinguishable from the behavioral and ethical patterns of those of us who call ourselves not Christians. When you ask young people today who have left the church why, often the answer is this: hypocrisy. They say they believe one thing and they don't do it. They claim to be following Jesus and they look nothing like him. You've heard me talk about Steve Addison's concept of middle tension. Basically, it says this: if we are so wildly different from our non-Christian friends that they can't possibly imagine themselves, much less desire, inhabiting our lives, then when we invite them to join us in following Jesus, we're not going to be very successful. And on the other side of the spectrum, if our lives are indistinguishable from the lives of our non-Christian friends, when we invite them to follow Jesus along with us, they're going to go, okay, what's the point? Clearly, he's made no difference in your life. So the assumption that Christians should be different, I think, is a good one. But the question that we're asking in this series is, how does that happen? How do we come to be more like Jesus? Do we just invite Jesus into our hearts and then kind of put the bus pass in our pocket and wait for heaven and hope that it all changes in the twinkling of an eye? Do we just believe a sheaf of true things and hope that the mere believing of them transforms our actions? Do we study and learn the life and teachings of Jesus and then just go out and give it a good college try? Or do we do nothing and hope that the Holy Spirit likes passivity for his modeling clay? One of the answers that the deep center current of historic Christianity has given to this question, how do we become more like Jesus, is this: Christian practices. It's what we're calling in this series Forming Habits. I'm so grateful for Jill and Sam kicking off this series so well. And one of the things you'll have heard Jill say in the first talk in this series is that title, Forming Habits, is a bit of a play on words. We mean forming habits in the sense of beginning patterns of behavior, but it's also meant in the sense of patterns of behavior that themselves shape us. They form us. And these formative habits are part of how we become different from the inside out. You remember Jesus interacts with the Pharisees in Matthew 23, and he says, you guys are just focused on the externalities. You just wash the outside of the dish. The inside of the cereal bowl is still filled with putrid milk and soggy Cheerios. And you're polishing the outside. We got to clean the whole thing, and that starts with washing the inside, transformation from within. I want to continue building on that foundation that Jill and Sam have laid for us. And to do that, I want to give us a bit of a conceptual framework. We're going to look at the role of these forming habits in bringing about change in our lives. And then we're going to, once we've established a bit of a framework, we're going to run Sabbath through that framework as a particular forming habit. So the goal of these forming habits, the goal of these Christian practices is to become like Jesus so that we naturally behave, supernaturally naturally behave as he would if he were in our shoes. And the method for this transformation is forming these habits that in the Spirit's power transform us from the inside out by changing our thoughts, by changing our instinctive responses and our habitual behaviors over time. All right, so here's a framework for why we do the things we do. In the biblical mindset, human persons are integrated wholes. We are integrated body and soul. We're not an immortal spark trapped helplessly in an evil material body for 80 years. We're not merely a mass of matter and chemicals with emergent properties of mind that cease within moments of our heart stopping. In the Bible's view, we are both body and soul, and they're both important to God. The Bible is not always consistent in the words it uses for these constituent parts, and that should not concern us, as the Bible was written across centuries and across cultures and different languages. I'm trying to summarize here and simplify with this diagram. In the non-material core of a person is what the Bible calls sometimes soul, sometimes spirit, a lot of times heart or some other organs. And this is where our deepest desires are. This is, you think of the psalmist, Psalm 103. Oh, my soul, bless the Lord. Forget not all his benefits. You know, it's this inner part of us. In the biblical view, this inner core is not all innocent, and nor is it irredeemably wicked. It was, as we saw in our Very Good series, it is designed by God with incredible potential and dignity, and as a result of sin, it's also warped. This inner core is where, in the biblical mind, our wills reside. Now, those of you who have done a lap or two in cognitive neuroscience, don't get bent out of shape. I'm not bunking frontal lobe science here. I'm just giving us an abstract framework. We'll come back to the will and its role in just a minute. So that's the inner concentric circle. Outside of that, we have the body. Now, in this framework, the body is not just flesh and blood. The body is your physical means of interacting with the world. It's the way we communicate with one another. It's our senses. It's the way we participate. And in this schema, this is where our automatic responses lie. This is where our habituated patterns of behavior hang out. So when I got up this morning and stumbled from my bed to the shower, I didn't have a deep longing in my soul to do that, and nor did it require an enormous amount of will. My body was almost on autopilot, doing what it had been trained by thousands of similar mornings to do. If you gave me a bike and asked me to ride it across this stage, I could probably do it pretty well. The muscle memory, the visual psychophysics, the cognitive neurological stabilizers, all of that would snap into place pretty naturally to do something that's actually remarkably complicated, an outlandishly difficult task. But if you've never learned to ride a bike and we gave you a bike and asked you to ride across the stage, it would be funny. It would be a disaster, no matter how much your heart longed to do it, and no matter how much your will was exerted to try to do it. The next concentric circle out is our environment. This is our social location. This is our cultural context. This is our built environment and more. All of these circles, you'll notice, are dashed lines because they're interpermeable. They influence one another both from the inside out and from the outside in. So if I am longing in my soul for an airier kitchen, I could exert my will through my body to pick up a sledgehammer and knock down a wall, changing my environment. And conversely, if I am in a setting that is brutally in the social environment, it can have an impact on my body physically. The body keeps the score and disfigure my soul and deplete my will. Roy Baumeister, probably the leading psychologist on the will writing currently, talks about how our wills are surprisingly potent and surprisingly depletable. We can do remarkable things through the will, through self-control, and they also get quickly exhausted, quickly depleted. Here's an excerpt from his great book, Self-Control. Self-Control. Willpower. There we go. People with good self-control mainly use it not for rescue in emergencies. Think about your own emergencies. But rather to develop effective habits and routines in school and at work. Those were the environments they were studying. They play offense instead of defense. Let me bring this home to roost. Most 12-step programs say that we are in greatest jeopardy of giving in to our temptations when we are hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. Imagine it's been a brutal week at work, high-stakes meetings. You've been exerting your will all week to look awake as your boss has yammered on. Don't nod, my team. You've been thinking hard, you've been exerting your will to stay attentive to these hours of boring spreadsheets, and you've had to make some really tough choices, and you've done a great job. You get home late at night, and you're exhausted, and that temptation comes knocking. Maybe it's drinking, maybe it's smoking, maybe it's watching porn. You fill in the blank. Even though you've demonstrated a ton of self-control all week, you are basically powerless now. And Baumeister would say this is because our finite reserve of willpower has been depleted. Surprisingly potent, surprisingly depletable. Because this willpower, this self-control is so depletable, we outsource enormous portions of our lives. They're largely automated. I'm not talking about AI. I'm just talking about things like the taking a shower in the morning, things like driving a car. I don't have to think really hard about that. But I'm also talking about how I respond to my kid when he's not doing what I told him to do. I'm also talking about the look that I almost instinctively flash at Jill when she reminds me I'm working on my phone when I should be present with my family. Most of our behavior is learned. It's responsive, it's habituated. And that's not a bad thing. It's a neutral thing. The degree to which it's good or bad depends on the types of emotions, thoughts, behaviors, interactions that we end up habituating. You tracking with me? That was a resounding silence. All right, back to the top. Dallas Willard, from whom much of this framework is adapted, puts it provocatively. He says, when Jesus is hanging there on the cross, looking down at the people who have taunted him, flogged him and are now spitting upon him as he hangs there with his last breaths. And he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Does he do that through an enormous exertion of will, gritting his teeth? Or does it naturally flow out of him because this is his character? His character is to love his enemies. Of course, we don't know. It's total speculation either way. The Bible doesn't tell us, but Dallas's point is this: our character drives our behavior. Remember what Jesus says in Luke 6. It's out of the overflow of the heart that the mouth speaks. Our behavior is a function of our habituated responses, and our goal is to end up with character that is like Jesus, so that our thoughts and our behaviors and our actions are like Jesus' thoughts and actions, behaviors would be if he were in our shoes. Are we tracking? Okay. So the Christian forming habits, the disciplines, the practices, whatever you want to call it, they operate with this in the background. This is the assumption. And they also operate with the assumption that God has designed us for certain things. He's made us on purpose. And then sin and other factors disrupt that design. And yet God has given us things that we can do in order to cooperate with his Spirit as he rebuilds us. So here it is in a graphical form. Formation. Formation is what we were designed for. God has made us for things. He's made us for love. He's made us for communion with him. He's made us for freedom. He's made us for creativity. And malformation comes along, forces within and without that eventually misshape us. But the Christian practices, the forming habits, sit in the counter formation. They position us for transformation. Here's a paraphrase of Willard on this. Forming habits are activities within our power that enable us to do things we cannot do by direct effort. So if there were a Father's Day ultramarathon today, I could not go out and run it just by an exertion of my will. Not today. Not ever. But I could, by an exertion of my will, today begin a couch to ultramarathon training program that would eventually build within my body and within my nervous system the ability to run an ultra. I said ultra, but it really could be a 5K. I cannot, by exertion of my will, become today someone who always loves his enemies, someone whose sense of worth is not at all bound up with my productivity, or someone who does not lust. But it is within my power to begin forming habits that in the Spirit's power gradually shape my character to be someone who naturally loves his enemies, somebody whose sense of worth is hid with Christ in God and not connected to my performance only, and somebody who naturally gazes upon others with the humanizing love of Jesus and not the objectifying eyes of lust. There is no definitive list of Christian practices. In this series, we're covering many of the historically significant ones, but it's not meant to be exhaustive. One tidy way of organizing these, if you like, is habits of engagement and habits of disengagement. Those that work on our do muscle and those that work on our soul's don't muscle. So here's a table that summarizes some of them for you. Now here's the thing, these habits, these practices, in and of themselves are not holiness or righteousness. And one of the reasons that I think a lot of us have an allergic reaction to them is because we assume that this is just another to-do that we're going to fail to do and then feel bad about ourselves. I think another reason that many of us have an aversion to them is because we've seen them used as a spiritual SAT, by which we look around at who on heaven's curve is above us and who's below us. But that's not what these are about. These practices are not an end in themselves. They're just a tried and true Christian method for forming character like Jesus. And this is helpful. They're not a one-size-all. I could not, I love this, I could not take you to the Gospels and say, Jesus practiced silence and solitude X number of times for Y frequency and for Z length, Z duration. I couldn't do that. And nor is anyone else's track record on these forming habits the measure for you. They're a method, they're not the measure. Okay, so that's a framework. Hopefully you tracked with a little bit about that. But let's run Sabbath as a particular practice through that framework now. We begin by assuming that the Bible is telling the truth, that God has designed us in love and on purpose, with purpose. We saw in our Very Good series, God creates us with such dignity. And even before he had given women and men anything to do, he surveyed creation and he rated it. Do you remember? Tov mehod, very good. He was pleased with them before they'd gotten anything right or anything wrong. That's so different from the ancient Near Eastern context, where often humans were understood to be the slaves of the gods. It's day 6, creation. Day 7 comes along. This is the pinnacle of creation. The other 6 days get singular mention. Day 7 gets 3 mentions in 2 verses. All the literary cues are telling us this is the high point. This is the pinnacle. The climax of creation is not the making of human beings. It is rest. It might seem like it's pedantic, but I think that shift captures something of the essence of the gift of Sabbath. Because my instinct is to put my own contributions, my own accomplishments at the center. It seems noble, it seems like the responsible thing to do, and it gratifies my ego. On those days, I'm killing it. And it crushes my ego on those days, I'm not. The gift of Sabbath is certainly not less than a gift of decentralizing our produce. It's a reminder that it is not all about what we bring to the table. So that's where the Bible begins with Sabbath. On the 7th day, God, the perfect being, rests. And the way the creation narrative has it, the first day on the job, as it were, for the human beings is a rest day. That's a boss I want. Welcome to the world God has made. Your first task is rest. You didn't earn it, but you don't need to. Enjoy it. The Christian life flows from rest. You are loved without earning it. Okay? Story hole. This is what we're made for. I love the way Marva Dawn puts it. This is what we celebrate on the Sabbath day. We join generations of believers going all the way back to God's people, the Jews, who set aside a day to remember that we are precious and honored in God's sight and loved, profoundly loved, she says, not because of what we produce. So this is God's good design for us, that we would know our security in him apart from performance. That's the formation bit. My wife, Jill, is a performer. She grew up in a family of singers and dancers, and play put her honors. And to this day, when we get together with her extended family for a reunion, someone usually brings choir parts, and they're like mandatory rehearsals, and then there's a performance. You feel my pain. The first time I was at a family reunion, someone handed me sheet music and told me to go sing with the tenors. And the second time I was at a family reunion, someone handed me a video camera and told me to record everyone who could sing. Many of our kids have that performing bone in them. I can tell that few things delight Jill more than watching our kids put on a play they've just made up, or for my 10-year-old boy to sing Shake It Off better than Taylor ever could. But the one thing that eclipses Jill's delight in our kids performing is when one of them falls asleep in her lap. Maybe it's after a long day together. Maybe it's after they just threw a tantrum and they've worn themselves out. But the kids asleep in Jill's lap are secure and loved, knowing that nothing they do or fail to do will make mom love them more or less. She loves them because she loves them, not because they performed well. Remember Exodus 16? God is providing food for his people in the wilderness, and it comes in the form of this mysterious bread that comes down like dew called manna. And there is work to be done. The people have to go out and collect it day upon day. And some of the people, unsurprisingly, try to increase their sense of security by gathering extra and storing it. No Yeti coolers yet. But anyway, they wake up the next day and they find that their manna is wormy and rotten. Except one special day of the week, God tells the people to gather extra because the next day is the Sabbath, their rest day. And this time, although they do nothing different other than obeying God by resting, the manna keeps over, unspoiled, and they have a day of resting just to enjoy being with God and being with each other. No gathering, no producing, no performing. I think a lot of us are like our Hebrew ancestors who try to gather extra. We think we can replace our security in God with a security that is grounded not in God, but in our productivity or our performance. And that ends up, friends, malforming us. Early in our marriage, Jill and I left great jobs leading a thriving church in Louisiana. We thought that's what God was inviting us to do. Still do, I think. But I was surprised to discover how much my sense of worthiness was tied up with my job. It was a church job. I remember my father-in-law kindly taking me to a lot of meet and greets of business leaders in their part of Florida, and you know how it goes with those things. The first question is always, what's your name? And the second, and that's on a name tag, so I don't really need to ask it. The second question is, what do you do for a living? Nothing cuts off, the only thing that cuts off conversation faster than the answer, I'm a pastor, is I'm a pastor who doesn't have a job. And the moment that I mentioned that I didn't have a job, I could see their eyes already shifting over my shoulder to find the next person to talk to. I went through many months of learning to disentangle my worth from my job. Sometimes we use our work to manufacture a false sense of security. And we do this for different reasons. We do this by accumulating wealth. We do this by projecting significance. How are you doing? Oh, busy. People need me. Or by avoiding discomfort. Sometimes our relationships suffer not because we're workaholics. Sometimes we are workaholics because we're using our work to numb the pain in our relationships or the pain inside us. None of these things are bad in and of themselves. Accumulating wealth, significance, avoiding discomfort. But when we use them to manufacture a false sense of security, they end up malforming us. Whether it's an environment, an external environment that leads us to think our value is in our productivity, or an internal void that drives us into this, when it gets habituated, it's a problem. We grab our phone reflexively at a stoplight to dash off a few emails. We put the laptop out on the counter to do some multitasking while you're making dinner with your roommate. None of these are a disaster in themselves. Productivity is great. But that habituation malforms us. Think back to those concentric circles of soul and body and environment. When the false security work gets habituated, our souls get malformed and they struggle to imagine, much less to enjoy, the grace of security in God that has nothing to do with our productivity. We need counterformation to shape our hearts to be able to experience that security in God apart from our performance. So here's counterformation. Sabbath keeping loosens the hold of false security and trains our heart to experience grace. I cannot will my way into experience security in God without performance. Have you ever tried it? I can't muster that feeling just by wanting to. Only God can give it. but I can exert my will to form a habit of Sabbath that loosens the hold of false security and that trains my heart to experience grace. Remember, grace definitionally is a gift you did not earn. What does Sabbath keeping look like today? As I mentioned, it's enjoying a renaissance in evangelicalism in the last decade or so, and the majority of it is really, really good. I'll point you to some resources in a minute. Sometimes, though, it kind of gets lumped in with a larger category of self-care. That can be confusing. Sabbath does end up caring for us, profoundly so. But it does so by contributing to the transformation of our souls, and it's fundamentally God-centered rather than self-centered like some of the things that get called self-care. Here's a table I shared with you years ago on a sermon on this that helps to differentiate, it helps to tease Sabbath out from vacation or a day off. Like the purpose of Sabbath is to receive the gift of rest and grace. It might involve some things that you would do on vacation or day off, but it's got a different purpose. The goal, well, not the goal, but the way Sabbath should leave you feeling is grateful. Not harried, not like, oh, shoot, I wish I'd gotten this done. Not even necessarily with a bank of adventurous memories, but grateful. Jill worked as a teaching assistant for Marva Dawn, and Marva Dawn helps to describe Sabbath in her wonderful book this way. Sabbath is keeping with these four movements: ceasing, resting, embracing, feasting. Ceasing, resting, embracing, feasting. Some of you will know the name of the Maryland pastor, Eugene Peterson. He studied right here at Hopkins. Didn't graduate, so there's hope for all of us. He had a wonderfully pithy description. He said, Sabbath is for playing and praying. Playing and praying. So Jill and I try to incorporate some play into our Sabbaths. Something frivolous. Something that gratuitous. Have you ever noticed in gratuitous play how wonder just opens up? Wrestling with your kids in the pool. Jill has this inflatable bull riding suit that she sometimes will pull out without notice to start a spontaneous dance party at bedtime. Mark Buchanan, in his lovely little book on the Sabbath, puts it this way. He says, play is subversive. It hints at a world beyond us. It carries a rumor of eternity, news from a kingdom where Chronos, the keeper of time, the stopwatch, and utility are no more welcome than death and Hades and the ancient serpent. When we play, he writes, we nudge the border of forever, and this also happens when we keep Sabbath. Till about 12 years ago, I've told you before, whenever I encountered a real Sabbath keeper, I would bludgeon them with some biblical theology. The arc of God's teaching on Sabbath makes it clear that Jesus himself is the fulfillment of Sabbath, and the Sabbath we all await is an eschatological rest in a new heavens and something to that effect. All true, but missing the gift. A couple in our small group were Sabbathers. She had a demanding career as a neurologist at Maryland. She's since gone on to head up the Lewy body dementia program at Florida. She told me she began Sabbathing in med school. Those of you who are busy, that's when she started. She thought her grades would suffer. But she had become convinced that this was a gift that God was inviting her to receive, so she planned ahead and she worked ahead so that her Sabbath day, which for her was Sunday, she could mark it off as special and rest. And actually, she found her grades did not suffer. She found the opposite, and I was intrigued. Sidebar here, the point of Sabbath is not to increase your productivity, but for those of us who like to get things done, often that's a byproduct. Late 18th century France, they're trying to scrub Jewish and Christian vestiges from the culture. They switched, you remember this? They switched to a 10-day week, easier math, more productivity time. Do you remember? It does not become more productive. Disaster, plummeting productivity, suicide rates go up, people burn out. So I was struck by this couple who are practicing Sabbath, have demanding jobs. Since then, Jill and I have been on a career of learning to receive the gift of Sabbath, and she'd be the first to tell you that we don't always do it well. Our typical Sabbath for us is Saturday. Sometimes we start it with a special breakfast. You've heard me talk many a time about overnight waffles. I've been slacking on those, but we still try to make it special. Maybe it's ice cream. We try to plan in activities that put us together as a family and or with other loved ones. We'll get back to this. Doing things that bring us a sense of joy in God's goodness. And this is a moving target. As our family grows and we've got sports games and other obligations, all those things have to be navigated, and our structure has to be reevaluated. Are these activities aligned with our value of keeping Sabbath? So here, I'm going to get super practical, and then we're done. If you're intrigued about trying to start forming a habit of Sabbathing, here's some practical suggestions. Start small. Don't be like, oh, I'm going to keep it for all perpetuity. Solid 36 hours. People do 24 hours. I'm doing 48 hours a week. Start small. Maybe start half a day. And say, I'm going to try to do this for a month or 2 months, and then I'll reevaluate. If it's really doing what it's doing, you should know. Start small. And make it enjoyable. Just from the social science of habit formation, we know how important rewards are. But Jill and I were like, we want our kids to love this. And so that's why we kicked it off with a great breakfast. And they do. They look forward to Sabbath. Think about things that will bring you energy. Not everything that is restful is good, and not everything that is good is restful. Here's a little energy matrix. Maybe you've used this in your workplace, but think through not only your Sabbath, but also your whole week. Who are the people and activities that energize you, and who are the people and what are the activities that de-energize you? Like, there are people in your family that you should spend time with. I'm not saying don't spend time with them, but maybe you can find, if they de-energize you, maybe you can spend time with them the other 6 days. I'm not kidding. The Sabbath is a gift. This is a time to celebrate the gift of rest. If you've hung out with me on a Saturday, you're energizing to me, or you slip through the cracks. Plan ahead. If you have a spouse or a family or a roommate or friends that you practice Sabbath with, it requires coordination so that one person is not Sabbathing at the other person's expense. I know the other McFaddens here, Ken and Allie, will trade off small snippets of solo parenting on their Sabbath Saturday so that the other can do something alone, because for parents of young kids, that's a gift. Jill and I have to talk through the things we need to get done in a weekend so that we both can be Sabbathing to the best of our ability, Friday dinner to Saturday dinner when I pick things up again. So plan ahead. All right. I'll show you some more resources in the screen, but I want to share this Milton poem with you as a way of landing. Milton lost his eyesight at age 40, working really hard for the government. And he was wrestling with his identity and his productivity before God. Here's his poem, When I Consider How My Light Is Spent. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve there with my Maker, and present my true account lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labor, light denied, I fondly ask, but patience to prevent that murmur soon replies, God doth not need either man's works or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke? They serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. Put this slide of resources up on the screen for you. And as Kim and the team come back, I'll close us in prayer. Father, would you do among us what I can't do with words? For those of us here, for whom the practice of Sabbath keeping would help them, to access the delight of unearned rest in you. Would you help us to be together a community where keeping Sabbath is running with the grain? And Father, would you help us to be a community where creating a false sense of security that is not grounded in you is not celebrated, but is received in grace and lovingly reoriented towards delight in your unearned love. We pray this in Jesus' name.